I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to participate, and we'll share some of the experiences that my organization, which is a little bit of a different one from some of the others that have been represented here, which is from the perspective of a county safety net hospital making some of these decisions. So, but we have been trying to implement what we've been talking about, which is taking high dimensional healthcare data and implementing that into predictive healthcare analytics and delivering good patient care. So hopefully this will be informative for the panel. So from a disclosures perspective, I have no consulting or equity disclosures. Like others have said, I do have institutional interests. So I'm a co-inventor on a patent that's for a clinical predictive modeling system, but all royalties are owned by the hospital system, not me. I'm an employee. So our hospital system has been perhaps not unique, but maybe among safety net hospitals, we were in many ways an early adopter. And I think a lot of people have talked about the need for institutional investments, institutional leadership to drive healthcare forward in implementing precision healthcare analytics. And we had that leadership in the form of some dynamic young investigators who are now getting dynamic graying investigators as we progress, and that have invested in this locally. And I think all of us acknowledge that one of the key factors for success is ongoing investment. So ongoing investment from a funding perspective from their healthcare systems. I think we've had other members of the panel today have mentioned that. From funders, both philanthropic, governmental, pharma, as they seek to solve problems and advance science. And in healthcare IT, so that's plumbing, getting bits and bytes, just where it needs to go for good routine clinical care, and then, but now investing in the infrastructure to filter that up and have it percolate to data warehouses, clinical registries, as well as to integrating with applications that can integrate this. And so our institution, went from initially bright ideas and leadership in some early publications to investing in a nonprofit associated with our healthcare systems focused on the development of expanding knowledge and through the implementation of prescriptive analytics and trying to bring these artificial intelligence or machine learning applications to the delivery of clinical care. And so we have both investments in IT data architects, data scientists and statisticians, and clinical investigators brought into one roof. And so it's a wonderful place for me to work. So I will shamelessly plug work that our organization has done, similar to the goals of this conference, which with funding from the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, we were early adopters in implementing large-scale predictive models using automated extraction of data and prediction of readmission risk for heart failure. And we're funded by the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation to disseminate that knowledge. And as part of that funding, we had a DC policy forum that brought together many experts in modeling, both in the healthcare systems setting, as well as on those that have done work for CMS. And if you look at, this is a framework I'll kind of circle back to at the end as we look to recommendations, but a lot of us have talked about the general framework of the triple aim, where you're trying to improve healthcare delivery for the patient, you're trying to improve patient satisfaction, you're also trying to drive value for the healthcare, and sort of by controlling costs. And we've talked about that in different ways. So the areas that were highlighted, and I think we'll use as touchstones for some of the recommendations, and hopefully this will resonate with many things that have been brought up by previous speakers yesterday and probably today. So, there were recommendations broken out in 5 domains. And so I think one aspect is around data barriers. So the lessons that we've seen, and the value of having common or interpretable data models, either that or complex data models, but with access to the people who can extract data from them. I think you can have one or the other. but as well as implementation of data standards that make working with people who are perhaps good at math or good at healthcare systems IT or software engineering architecture, but do not have clinical domain knowledge. You need to have mappings to ontologies that then a non-MD, PhD can work with. So, my value in clinical informatics is I'm the MD, PhD trying to bring that back and work with those people, but that won't work with every programmer in Silicon Valley. Other things that have been driven that are data barriers are things that are well known about the frustrations about moving data in and out. So we're almost, coming up on 80 years since Claude Shannon started developing information theory. It would be nice that we have data not be transferred in the healthcare systems via fax, like Amy Abernethy was mentioning. There have been progress in that, and I think meaningful use standards have advanced the conversation. There are now a more standard set of documents that are exchangeable through interchange standards like HL7 and now FHIR, the Fast Healthcare Interoperable Resources. So those will allow you to do things like use a web API to request all the labs on a patient, by LOINC code, a well-maintained ontology of laboratory results. If your healthcare system has mapped their labs to LOINC, which most haven't. And so, those are existing barriers. We've had, I think Dr. Freely had mentioned some of the issues around ethics, healthcare equity, privacy issues. So I think that's a recurring issue where the implementation to make sure that there's access to medications. So I work at a safety net hospital. Changes to the 340B pricing policy for a safety net hospital where oncology spending is one of the highest loss leaders in our institution for the large fraction who are not covered by CMS funding, which is sadly a large part of the safety net population in Dallas, Texas. And participation in these projects that are generating data to drive things forward. And so, we have a diverse population, a large Hispanic population, reasonably large fraction of African American populations. If those populations are not participating in the development of healthcare prescriptive analytics and next generation data, they are not going to benefit from it. Again, our local solution from that is we recognize, and we had leadership pushing that as a problem locally. And so our way of making sure our models include our population of interest is develop our models ourselves. That's not sustainable for every healthcare system, but that has been our solution. Focused on transparency. I think we've had several speakers that have mentioned it. I think I would say I have mixed feelings about this. So if you ask someone, can you recognize somebody's faces? Most people that studies now can show you can recognize about 5,000 faces on average. Do you know how your fusiform gyrus recognizes faces? No. But you have gone through a selection process where there's a general population agreement that everyone can recognize faces if you don't have prosopagnosia. So that, I think generally, if something has survived long enough and proven valuable, it can be a black box. When you're trying to build an artificial neural network to develop faces, you might want to know how it works, and that it doesn't recognize you at the border and say that you're a Canadian citizen with marijuana. So I think there's depending on where you are in the spectrum, we are obviously in precision oncology at the very early part of that spectrum, and so focusing on transparency is good now because I think we want to understand the features that are being identified in high dimensional data sets that are of value. I think there will be probably generational turnover in this as it moves forward. Regulation in the form of the FDA and CMS policy recommendations I think are clearly within the domain of this conference to push for some flexibility, some free market incentives to drive people to find solution, funding incentives to drive investigators seeking advancement and funding and oxygen and mortgage payments for their family to get funding. I think there's also, I can also speak a little bit maybe on the panel to the extent that Medicaid or CMS reform can drive some of these things, so that to the extent that quality metrics can drive activity, certainly when you start threatening payment or giving everyone a haircut or a little bit of a lift on their payments, like the CMMI oncology care model is doing, that drives attention from the healthcare system, including leadership at the CFO, CEO, CIO level, and that does help bring focus to the problem. But I think, you look at the metrics that are measured that are related to oncology, and it's delivering HPV vaccines, it's screening for average risk colorectal cancer, and mammograms. Okay, what about the people who are under 50 that don't know that they're high risk for oncology? And is their family history being screened? You have millions of people that have had their GEDCOMs uploaded into GEDmatch and be identified as a serial killer, but you don't know if they're at high risk using Giovanni Parmigiani's BRCA-Pro or PANC-Pro Bayesian model to know that they're at high risk for BRCA or a pancreatic cancer gene. Education and training has been highlighted also by others that, there's 3 questions asked on every board exam about sensitivity, specificity, and PPV. We could probably do a little bit better than that, but I would hope that those things are hammered in more than 2 minutes per lecture, which is what I think Craig was mentioning. All of this, though, will get boiled down, though, and so I think the rubber meets the road is how do we implement this? So I have a brief story about how we've implemented this in the setting of oncology. Predictive models have to be of value in the healthcare system. So they can be identification models, they can be risk stratification models, they can be linked to prescriptive analytics. And so we've been talking a lot about that in oncology, but those are not the only needs. They just have to operate on different time scales. So we've talked about precision, genomics, and that's a week or more time scale. There's other things that have to happen on the, these large-scale predictive models have to happen on the order of minutes, and so we're doing that with sepsis and in-house cardiopulmonary arrest models. Those require different levels of engineering and interfaces, but those things are now possible. The CMMI is focusing on care transformation and moving forward things with the oncology care model, and so data-driven data-driven quality improvement is kind of where the focus of our work has been driven, and but that could focus on different aspects. And so I'm going to talk a little bit on some of the other things we're talking about, the softer aspects, which is let's assume in the future there will be good drugs to tie for people. So I don't think that has to block the development of the analytics in the meantime. And so this is an approach that I'm going to share someday about where we risk stratified people. We're not tying that to their prescription needs, but we are targeting it to their care management and patient navigation needs. And that's through, and we ended up picking a final common pathway that involved improved communications rather than CAR T cells. So like you said, machine learning pipelines, a lot of pipeline science could be resolved, but these are recurring issues that you need to move data through, have talented mathematicians explore the data to help build models. Modeling techniques, again, if you have good data in and understanding of the clinical space, there's a lot of modeling techniques can be applied. So I don't know that you have to do anything. I do think model choices have implications about the transparency and interpretability of the data. I'll touch on that. And then you have to find a way to deploy it and then have, in the learning healthcare system, reinforcement learning at the healthcare system level, not reinforcement learning necessarily in the model where you're retraining the model all the time. We had for this problem, we developed a problem space where we defined in the spirit of the oncology care model, try to improve care and navigation for patients that are at risk for increased hospitalization costs that included inpatient observation and ED costs after an IV visit for chemotherapy. And so we developed a model. Took 3 years of patient data since we're an early adopter of Epic, which is all in one EHR, so we don't have some of the frustrations of switching EHRs midstream. And then tested with different models. The final model was a random forest model that was selected as a machine learning on topic type model, but I'll discuss why we did that. And then we worked with our local clinical leaders to implement a delivery system. Perhaps this is not the fastest time scale, but I think this is realistic time scale when you look at data munging, cleaning, developing problems for a targeted clinical process, getting data together, developing a good model, socializing that with your healthcare leaders. Then implementation is another delay. So it took some time between final conception of the problem and implementation. To get value from the data sets, again, I think we've touched on ontologies, but you have to to get value out of a data set, you have to have pertinent things going into it. We're focused on things in the care delivery system. So that included transformation of administration data, windowed time features on various lab data, time and trend functions on the vital sign data, socioeconomic data, because of reasons I've touched on, and treatment-related variables. And so, several of the mathematicians have touched on the fact that they're nonlinear features. And if a doctor wants to understand that, you might make a choice of including things like spline logistic models or something like that to include this. This problem set, the decision was we want the best accuracy for high-risk stratification, so we're okay with a black box method in this setting, in which case using a machine learning and a random forest model was acceptable. So we did sort of a standard split of the data, developed a random forest model using open source software, implemented that model, which had a reasonable predictive probability. So one of the other things I had talked about, if you have interpretability issues, we did provide some summary of some of the inputs that went back to the doctors that was available. Again, like some of these 40-page genomics results, if you get a risk score with every predictor in the risk score, the doctor occasionally will be interested, but usually it's the first time they look at the report they're interested, and then they just want to know the risk score. One thing that we have done for a lot of our predictive models in the hospital is we implemented what we call a silent mode. So we developed the transformations in the ETL processes, put it back in, but then run it not in production so that we have a different time period to validate the inputs and validate that the calibration of the model. That also gives us time to put into place governance times. We linked to an IVR, so a different app system to do the patient navigation. So we would risk stratify, but then the IVR is the scaling. So when you ask doctors what to do for high-risk people, they didn't know. So what we did is we called people and said, do you need help? With an automated scalable system, people that asked for help were then followed up with a nurse call line that directly reached out and tried to arrange either same-day visits, prescription, patient education to deal with side effects, pain, or problems with understanding. So we had a standard set of questions that were asked, and the people that flagged things beyond a threshold were forwarded to the care management. We saw modest reductions in the hospital utilization for people. Again, it didn't meet our threshold for like automatic going forward with the contracting with this provider, but it was suggestive. And again, subset analysis, we looked at people, obviously if you respond to the phone calls, you did a little bit better. But again, this was sort of an approach. So I'm running over, so we'll just try to deal with some of these issues on the panel discussion. But I think that this kind of highlights that we don't have to have all problems solved to move forward in developing avenues of precision that can help oncology patients, precision healthcare analytics that can benefit oncology patients. So we do want to be a learning system, and I've learned to help those people that fund our research. So great thanks to Lyda Hill and the Gordon Betty Moore Foundation and the directors of the Oncology Service, John Cox, Sharice Reddy, and the data scientists and project managers who made this happen. Thank you for your time.